This is my topic. I'm looking at the outlook for oils and meals. And thank you very much for the introduction. So I know we're a little bit under time pressure, so let us have a look. What I'm showing you here is the prices of soybeans and, sorry, I'm trying to read my screens here. I'm trying to hear the prices over the period all the way back to 2018 and then going back just to last year. And you can see this incredible turbulence. Back in 2018, if you look at the diagram there, the green line is FOB Paranaguá in Brazil. You can see Brazilian prices briefly during the trade war went far above US Gulf prices, which are in black, and then things gradually returned a bit more to normal. And interestingly, all the way through 2019 and into early last year, things were quite stable in terms of price. And then we see the prices taking off. And to highlight this, in the right side, I just focus on the period since the start of last year. What happened was, first of all, with Chinese buying, the Chinese bought lots of Brazilian beans. Brazilian farmers oversold forward, and there was this unusual period when Brazil even had to import beans because they had oversold. And you can see that the Brazilian prices went significantly above US Gulf again. And demand logically switched back to the States. And eventually, as demand came back, US prices, and these are, even in Iowa, they went above Brazilian prices. And finally, some Brazilian beans came into the US. But the basic picture is clearly of very strong prices. This is a remarkable bull market, which we have seen in many commodities. If we turn to the products, on the left, and I've taken a long period all the way back to the start, more or less, of the 2000s, you can see soy meal prices, US in green, Brazil FOB prices in black, and there are the Chinese prices, always a bit higher, in blue. And you can see that in the last year, we've had the spike again in meal prices, but the meal prices are lagging quite a bit below their peaks in the last two run-ups that we saw. In the case of oil, again, we see a run-up, but if you look at it, I think you will start to agree with me that oil has gone up much more than meal in the last 12 months. In fact, you can see in Brazil, prices have almost trebled in the most recent period. And so in order to highlight this, I thought let's zoom in on the last 12 months to compare what's happened with meal and what's happened with oil. And here we are. It looks less dramatic, but it doesn't hide the reality that we see this big increase in both markets. But here we have for meal, we have US meal prices, and these are the Decatur prices in Illinois. We have the Brazilian, and these are FOB prices, Paranaguá, and here we have the Chinese Dalian prices. And it certainly went up, and for Brazil and US, they went up by nearly 2/3 in the last 12 months. When we look at oil, you can see it is much more dramatic. In the case of meal, one thing that is worth knowing is China has more than half of the world's pigs. And China is such a big market for meal. And as I will explain later, in China, for a couple of reasons, their meal demand has not been quite as strong recently as their oil demand. And that has been a moderating influence, at least inside China, on the meal market. These are monthly prices I am showing you here. But if we go to oils, the biggest single factor, I would say, besides poor oilseed crops for canola, rapeseed, for sunflower, not such wonderful soybean crops, especially in Argentina, and palm has not been good. But the big changer, I would say, has been biofuels. Biodiesel demand, which is nothing to do with the general economy. It is policy driven, and biofuel demand has been strong, and it has pulled up the vegetable oil prices in the way you see. In the case of Brazil, it's been particularly strong because they oversold beans, the harvest was slightly late, and ultimately the government has at last suspended for 4 months the rise in the local biodiesel mandate. But from August, after August, they say it will come back. But policy has been a big driver in biofuels on the oil's price. With the difference between the oil market boom and a slightly less frantic meal market, the oil share of product value has leapt. This is taking CBOT prices, taking the futures for oil and meal as a percent of product value. And you see that for a long time, you can see that the oil share was trading between 30–35%. And suddenly, and again, these are monthly prices, on a daily basis, it's gone even further. We are getting back to the kind of situation we had back in the late 2000s during that brief commodity spike as we came up to 2012, where the oil share is getting up to 45%. And there are some countries, the best example is India, which imports oil and exports meal, where the oil share is now well over 50%. So in some countries, beans are becoming an oil crop, less than a meal crop. I mean, this is a big leap that we have had. To try to understand what's happening, I thought it would be useful to see how the WASDE forecasts have evolved, because WASDE is independent and it is a very influential driver of the world market sentiment. And this diagram is showing you the WASDE forecasts, and start here with the output of beans. This was their final, these are in thousands and millions, actually, metric tons. This is their final 2018-19 figure, 361 million metric tons. In 2019-20, largely because the US had a big decline, Brazil went up, Argentina came down, rest of the world was flat. The world output fell by over 20 million metric tons. Interestingly, the total didn't really change very much from, I start off in May 2020 for the 2021 forecast. I then jump forward 6 months to November, and then I come to the latest estimate, May 2021. It's interesting, the total output figure has hardly changed. The US figure has hardly changed. The main change was an increase in Brazil and a decrease in Argentina. And then when we look at their first forecast for next year, you can see that there's a rise in the US, a rise in Brazil, a recovery in Argentina. And so you can see, interestingly, because remember, between really November and May, we saw the leap in prices, but it's not driven by output for sure. Output forecasts for the world didn't change. And let's look at what happened with the crush. Now there is a change. For the total for the world, and I've added China here because it is so important. For the world, the crush was 298 million in 2018-19. Final WASDE figure. 2019-20, it rose by about 13 million to 311 million tons. What has been the biggest change has been a gradual increase in the world total from May to November to May this year. And you can see it rises again in their first forecast for next year. For the US, there has been an increase, but to be honest, not a very big one. Brazil, an increase. Argentina actually came down, then up. We see China had a big increase between May and November, and actually it has come off because of African swine fever, which has lowered their figure since 6 months ago, but still an increase over the year. Interestingly, the other countries have maintained their crush more strongly than USDA originally expected. The impact of the coronavirus was less than they expected. So for the world, during this 12-month period, their estimate for this year rose by about 10 million metric tons. So we had flat output and a steady increase in the crush, which is expected to continue next year. And I think these are sensible revisions as the year has changed. So where does this all go? This all feeds into stocks. And that is what really has changed sentiment. For the world, final ending stocks were about 113 million tons in 18-19, the final figure. For 2019-20, it was down to 96 million. And you can see the big fall was in US. Remember, the US had a very poor crop, but there was a fall in Brazil, fall in Argentina, but a rise in China and a rise also in other countries, which are less visible. During this year, they actually started WASDE expecting a small rise in the world total, largely because of Brazil. And they came off by 12 million tons by November, and since then they have stabilized. But look at the states, went from 11 million to 5 million to 3 million, and as we go into next year, they do not see very much of a US increase. The big change has been gradually increasing, not production, but crush. And where it has been felt is on the stock figure. And where it's really been felt has been in the US. In China, you will see the stocks have increased, and I think that is true. Although I must make a general comment. China, you may have I don't know how closely any of you follow China. It's jolly important, but the Chinese have basically banned the leading independent agents, private company that analyzes China's supply and demand for grains and for oilseeds and oilseed products, because they were showing China had tiny stocks of corn. They didn't like that. They always published big figures. The truth is that Chinese corn prices have gone way above wheat prices, so feed demand has switched to wheat, but the Chinese didn't like it. So I no longer fully trust these Chinese figures, but I think it is right that the Chinese are importing from Brazil. They bought forward, but the crushing has been hit by African swine fever. So some of this is now coming into inventory. But the point is the market watches the US, and US stocks are incredibly low. So we're starting with very low stocks of beans in the key country the world follows, which is the States. But let's now look at what's going on to the product market. And the key one I feel right now is oil, and it's driven by biodiesel. And this gives you an indication of the frenzy in the US biodiesel market. What is surprising to me is that in the face of this huge disparity between vegetable oil prices and petroleum prices, and between biodiesel and diesel prices, most governments around the world have not reined in their mandates. And in the US, with the Californian low carbon fuel standard, Germany with its somewhat equivalent policy, both big markets for diesel and biodiesel, demand is rising. And the best indicator is what are called RINs. These are traded certificates that reflect the price of blenders and so on buying biodiesel to meet the mandate. And you can see how this price has increased. And I measure on the right in blue the equivalent value in cents per pound of soy oil. For regular biodiesel, since the start of 2020, the value of these certificates has increased from about 6 cents per pound of soy oil to nearly 40 cents. And that's all being reflected in the soy oil price. For renewable diesel, which has a higher energy value, the RIN value is even higher. It's about 45 cents a pound of soy oil today. So for renewable diesel, which is being demanded in California, the market is pricing in a huge premium for soy oil to meet the mandate. And this isn't just in the US, this is everywhere. And so biodiesel is creating this disparity between fuel and vegetable oil prices. Now, I'm going to show you one slide about palm, because traditionally palm has been the biggest single source of vegetable oil to the world market. But I want to show you how palm's growth has more or less ceased. In the left, I show you percentage growth in the oil palm area, Indonesia, annual growth, and Malaysia. Because it's a tree, it takes time for the trees to become yielding. But you can see the black line, the growth in Indonesia is now down below 2%. Actually, the area is negative growth now in Malaysia. Palm area growth because of pressure from environmentalists. In particular, palm is not going to be expanding much area. And if you look at the right-hand slide, you will see palm is highly labor intensive. They are not being able to increase their yields. So oil palm is not going to provide this extra supply of oils going forward over the next decade, for sure. Probably soybean will be the key driver. So, summarizing where we are so far, and I will then say a word about meal. The supply-demand balance for beans we've seen is very tight, especially in the States, and there have been now some imports into the States. In South America, generally, it's less tight, but we see the problem in Argentina, quite apart from low levels of the Paraná River, which is making some difficulties in shipping the beans, but nobody wants to sell if you're a farmer, if you don't have to. They don't trust the currency. And Brazilian farmers have sold forward to China, and China seems happy to sit on its stocks. US and CBOT prices set the world price, and we just saw the WASDE stock estimates. So we can see low stocks, high price. But underpinning this strong price is the soy oil. Soy oil is getting up towards 50%, not yet there in US, but in India above 50% of the bean value. Already non-food uses of oils, mainly biodiesel around the world, are over a quarter of all world vegetable oil demand. And except for a temporary cutback in Brazil's mandate and a lowering of the Argentine mandate because the government wanted to ease pressure on local oil prices for food, except for that, there's been very little response from governments. Instead, the low carbon fuel standard, the RFS, the renewable fuel standard, green fuel initiatives, Indonesia, Brazil, EU, they are all boosting fuel demand for oil, including, of course, soybean oil. If we jump now just to try to understand what's going on in meal, about just over 30% of the world's soybeans go to China. And we see on the left how the Chinese have switched between Brazil and US, partly seasonal, for their bean imports. And the US was supplying a lot to China, but from now on it's going to be Brazil, Brazil, Brazil. But if we try to see what's happening in the next few months, it is said by the Chinese industry about 10 million tons a month are forecast to be arriving. So I put it in the May as an estimate, coming into China. And they are, you can see here in black is the number of pigs. They are starting to rebuild the pig herd after their latest African swine fever epidemic. But while that has had some effect on meal demand, the shortage of corn, I told you the Chinese government was clearly lying about its corn stocks. Shortage of corn has led to feed wheat being cheaper than corn. And when you use feed wheat, you tend to use less meal. And the government is even encouraging livestock farmers, please switch some of your meal demand away from soy meal, use amino acids, use feed wheat. So soy meal demand, I think, will not in the short term be quite so strong in China, but they will have the beans when they need them for crushing. They will build up stocks. So China is playing a pivotal role in the world bean and meal markets. It's not only the biggest user of meal, but it's affected by wider developments, as I just mentioned. The scarcity of local corn is pushing users towards wheat, which you blend with a lower percentage of meal in compounding. As we know, China has hedged its bets after the trade dispute with the States, and its forward purchases of Brazilian beans are being reflected in large shipments, some of which surely will go into inventory. But think of what this means for oil. Less crushing for meal means less oil in China from their crushers. Therefore, the Chinese, whose oil demand is not going down, they've recovered from the pandemic, they need more oil imports. They can't import much more canola, there's none left. They can't import much sunflower, there's not much left until the harvest. And palm oil availability is still low. It's the low period for palm oil output. So oil's prices have risen. We are increasingly in a world where oil is leading the crush. And if so, we have to wait for meal to start to expand its share of feed markets. And I think that means the divergence between oil and meal price performance will continue for a while. And with that, thank you very much indeed. Back to Carlos as the MC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Well, the good thing is that while you spoke, our audience has more than doubled. I guess that depends on what your base was to see the magnitude. Quick question, and I appreciate the insight. You know, we've seen crush margins improve. We've heard of cash crush margins certainly have an increase in the U.S. and globally. And I think it is pretty evident that the shares of oilseed processors have improved in value. I saw an announcement today that says that Cargill heads to record profits. I see that new crushing plants are being built in Canada and in the US. So clearly we see the market reacting to what you have alluded. My question to you is, how big is the gap? In other words, how much do we need to increase capacity, crush capacity in the US to fulfill this demand? I think in the US, we might be crushing close to 59, 60 million metric tons. How much more do we need to crush? What does it mean to the soybean farmer? And how much does the industry need to invest really to be able to achieve and satisfy the demand on the biofuels and as well the human consumption demand, which is also growing? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. A good question. I mean, if you believe some of these projections of the biofuel, and I'm including the renewable diesel, because that is where it's going to be. I don't know how many people realize that in the States, the blend wall, so-called, where because of the warranties on engines and so on, where you cannot use biodiesel, you must FAME, fatty acid methyl ester. You have to use renewable diesel, which is just like very clean diesel fuel. That blend wall limit is 5%. And to achieve these low carbon fuel targets, and it's somewhat similar in Europe as well, they have a slightly higher blend wall, you can only use in the diesel side, you can only use renewable diesel. Now, I think the policies had been devised assuming there was a lot of low grade, what in Europe they define legally as waste, which means animal fat, tallow, and so on. And it also means yellow grease, white grease, used cooking oil, and so on. But these, if you think logically, how do you increase the supply of these? You know, if you have meat packers, they're not going to double their output just to supply renewable diesel plants. The US will probably, being logical, become an importer of tallow rather than exporter, because the demand will drive trade. But these are not flexible, you know, economists would not say elastic sources of supply. So you have to go to vegetable oils, which I somehow think policymakers had not always anticipated. And in the States, the obvious source, and I could mention also, by the way, corn oil from the ethanol plants. But the thing is, the corn ethanol mandate is, I think, not expected to grow. So that supply is fixed. So you have to turn to soy oil or canola oil. I mean, those are the two North American sources of oil. And so you then get into the world where you have to say, do I believe all these targets? Will California, now joined by Oregon, being joined by Washington State, British Columbia has done it just across the board. Something about West Coast, they love renewable diesel. But if you add some of these projections together, I would say, I'm doing a quick mental calculation. I mean, you could easily imagine, if it's all supplied from the US soy industry, the US does it alone, you could maybe add 50% to crushing. You know, because of the growth in oil. I think in the end, there will be, like I say, maybe importing animal fat. There will be some diversion of trade. But even so, this is a big, big challenge. And you will know all of these renewable diesel announcements coming from petroleum companies who believe electric vehicles, but diesel will be the hardest to convert. Heavy vehicles cannot convert to electric so easily. So that is the best segment to be in.
Yeah. James, if we have to expand the crush capacity, you know, in theory, I mean, as I think some of the CEOs of the major companies have indicated, you know, it takes 2.5 to 3 year lead time to expand crush capacity. It's not like you can turn on the switch and say, hey, here we go. What are some of the impacts on the meal component, right? Let's say you said 50%. Well, that's 30 million metric tons. I'm not going to go through the math. I'm going to say 20 million metric tons of meal when we export maybe 12 million metric tons or 11 out of the US. Okay, where will this soybean meal go? At what price will soybean meal get to be included further in the rations? What is the sensitivity of that expansion? What are going to be some of the impacts? I imagine beneficial to some feed compounders. I would imagine that soybean meal will compete and remove some other ingredients out of the rations. How do you see that playing out? Where will this meal go? What will U.S. meal exports look like 5 years from now?
Well, I mean, there are many possibilities, some of them more intriguing, but I don't think these will be big volumes if you're looking, say, 5 years out. Will be, you know, with the movement, which I know is strong, at least in Europe, away from meat-based protein towards vegetable protein diet. Well, whatever they say with all these fancy things, a vital ingredient is soy protein. So soy protein concentrate, for some more premium products, soy protein isolate. I am sure you're going to see things done to make the soy protein penetrate more other markets. Things like aquaculture, where fish meal is, you know, it's a waste of good fish, a lot of it. It should actually go back into food, not into feed. And, you know, with clever processing and addition of various chemicals, you can make it attractive to fish. Those are the novel markets. But no, the big answer, in my view, is protein There will be substitutability in some markets with regular carbohydrate, with grains, that boundary in formulations will have to shift. Meal will have to start to compete more. A bit you're seeing it in China with the feed wheat, feed corn, and so on, this kind of adjustment. I think meal, we're going to see beans become more an oil crop, and the meal will have to find its price in order to compete more in what was the conventional grain market, which will encourage maybe novel ways of feed formulation.
Excellent. Excellent. I appreciate it. James, it's always
Thank
a
you.
pleasure to have you with us. And if you're okay, we will post this recording in some of our social media, so some other people that were not able to participate can benefit from this as well. Thank you very much, James. I would like to welcome our next speaker, presenter, Mr. Drew Lerner. I don't think Drew requires an introduction. I think we know, the industry knows Drew very well. We always appreciate his objective perspective on weather, and jokingly I said maybe your presentation has changed in the last 15 minutes, Drew. I don't know, but maybe you can tell us a little bit of what's been happening and what is the latest on weather and conditions that you see today, and where should our farmers and our customers around the world be looking at? What are going to be some of the major drivers to be considered in the next couple of weeks? Thank you and welcome.
Great. You're absolutely right. I took full advantage of the previous presentation and did add some slides and change a few things. And we do have some updated information. So you'll be seeing that pretty hot here right off the press. So let's just jump in here if we can. I don't know that I got my screen to share. There we go. Get the PowerPoint over here. All right, well, what I'm going to do here over the next couple of minutes is I want to indeed go through some of the oilseed and coarse grain producing areas of around the world and focus a little bit on the trouble spots and the areas of great interest. And certainly the weather is going to have a big factor, certainly in North America, as we go forward through these next few weeks. And so let's kind of get started with that. Very first thing at this chart, even though it says April 30th, it hasn't changed any really. I think the only thing that's changed on this chart since the 30th of April is the rain that occurred just this past week in Canada. And I'll show you some more about that here shortly. And also eastern Mexico has had some improved rainfall in the past couple of weeks as well. And so we are seeing at least a little bit of this massive drought across North America beginning to be nibbled away. The unfortunate part is for the US and Canada, as we're getting into the warm season, it's very hard to remove a drought of this intensity at this time of the year, just simply because of the heat that comes on during the summer months, and the evaporation rates get so high that it's very hard to counter the evaporation with the rain that we usually get. So this is a snapshot of the seriousness of the drought that we've had in North America. And as we've gone through these last few weeks, we have managed to see at least a little bit of change take place. In the US, we have had a relatively favorable distribution of rain across the Midwest, even though this percentage of normal chart would leave a little bit of question as to how good the moisture profile is. There has been a very definite below average precipitation bias across the majority of the northern plains and the upper Midwest. And we want to be concerned about that area in particular, just simply because of the fact that this area here in the upper parts of the Midwest and northern plains will have a higher potential for churning dry again late in the growing season. This would be in July and August. And we could see this dryness expand farther to the south and farther to the both west and east, depending on how strong a ridge of high pressure evolves over the summer. So we'll be focusing on that and what the potential is for seeing dryness expanding across some of these areas as we go forward in time. The bottom chart here shows the departure from normal precipitation over the 30-day period ending late last week. And these deficits are not that big. And we can fix the situation there relatively quickly with 1 or 2 storms. And the next couple of weeks, we are going to see a succession of storm systems move across this area that will offer temporary relief. In the meantime, the rest of the key U.S. crop areas are going to see a more routine occurrence of precipitation. Now, I do want to point out the current soil moisture situation across the U.S. From a corn and soybean perspective in the Midwest, the conditions really aren't bad at all. There's been a lot of speculation about this summer maybe turning too dry and hot. I think some forecasters have been suggesting, at least once a while back, they were suggesting that we would have a drought as serious as 2012. Well, I don't agree with those comments, and I'm going to show you why. But when we get started here, we want to look at this soil assessment. And the very first thing we want to do is point out the fact that there's good soil moisture present across a fair amount of the western Corn Belt right now. We've had quite a bit of precipitation occur in this area. The soil situation is really good. The planting progress has been great this season for all of the Midwest. And it looks like we'll have moisture around for this crop to get well established. And I'm talking for both corn and soybeans right now. The eastern Midwest, you'll notice here that there is a drying bias here. The soil has firmed up in the topsoil level. Rather notably this past week, we've seen a lot of warm and dry weather that has occurred, and that has accelerated the drying rates across the region. However, subsoil moisture in that area is still good. And according to the bottom chart, all the green there is adequate soil moisture. So the situation is really not too terribly threatening. And since we're still in the process of planting some of the crops across the Midwest, having a week of warm and dry weather is really perfect for getting accelerated field work accomplished. And so the situation is really largely beneficial. Excuse me. The northern plains, if you'll notice here, the region doesn't look as dry as that percentage of normal precipitation chart was suggesting. And the main reason for that is because it's been raining off and on a little bit since late last week. And we're going to see some more rain occur in this region as time moves along. And if you have any interest in wheat areas and the hard red winter wheat areas in the central portions of the U.S. plains, that area is seeing a frequent occurrence of rain, which is a little unusual for this time of the year, and it is going to continue for a while longer. That could raise some interest out there because of a lower quality crop is possible if it continues to rain while that crop goes into the filling and maturing stage and gets ready to be harvested. So we'll be watching those areas out there across the plains. Notice also the temperatures have been cool, a lot cooler than a lot of folks expected it to be this spring. And that's one of the other things that has really helped out. So when we go back and look at the percent of normal precipitation and see all the area that's been below normal on precipitation, with the temperatures being cool, our soil moisture has been conserved, and we really haven't got very dry across very many areas. And so this is a favorable factor too, although there is now more interest in getting it to warm up better. Well, what about Canada? Canada, of course, produces a very large canola crop, a very popular crop there, and there's also an increasing amount of soybeans that are produced in eastern parts of the prairies, including Manitoba and parts of eastern Saskatchewan. They have been in a multiple year drought that actually is 4 years old. And the subsoil moisture in Canada's prairies, the eastern part of the prairies, has been very, very low. This soil assessment was reflective of conditions last Friday. Last Friday, there was a new storm system that was working its way through the prairies. It was so dry across parts of Canada that some of the early planted crop had not had a chance to germinate. I'm talking about canola right now. But it hadn't been planted very aggressively, and it wasn't germinating, emerging very well. And there was a lot of folks that were really quite concerned that there wasn't going to be enough moisture for that crop to even get out of the ground. Well, things started to change over these past several days. We picked up on a lot of precipitation across the prairies, and these maps, the top one is the 7-day period ended on Saturday, representing the first 2 storm systems that impacted the region. And these 2 were focused on 2 areas. One was in the south and eastern parts of the prairies where we saw sufficient amounts of moisture. The other was back here in central parts of Alberta, and both areas getting a decent amount of moisture. That left a hole in the middle, but we had a new storm system that occurred Sunday night and through yesterday, and it filled that gap really quite favorably. And we got precipitation in the same area that was missed by last week's precipitation. So the entire prairies have seen significant moisture in the past 7 days. And that is what we're talking about as far as changes in the last 15 minutes, because we have seen a significant amount of improvement take place. Obviously, the topsoil has become favorably moist. And this totally changes the prospects for canola planting in Canada. A much more aggressive planting season is now going to take place, and the crop has sufficient moisture to not only get started, but perhaps it can tap into some subsoil moisture reserve and continue to develop. But notice the bottom chart here. As of this morning, we're still very low on subsoil moisture, as you would think that would be the case with 4 years of drought. So they are not out of the woods yet, even though the next few weeks look to be very promising. It's going to be imperative that they get additional rain to fall as we go forward through these next few weeks, because we do expect the late summer to turn dry in July and August, especially in the southeast half of the prairies. So getting this moisture for planting was extremely important, but seeing follow-up precipitation in the area is going to be equally important. And that's where we're going to go here for a moment or two. And it's not just the Canadian prairies. This includes the northern U.S. plains and the upper U.S. Midwest. As I showed you on the a couple of slides back, that area still has a drier bias. And all of these areas have a vulnerability for being dry as we go into the summer this year, in July and August in particular. And that could still cut into canola yields, as well as corn and soybean yields and other crops that are produced in these areas, along with spring wheat, in fact. What you're looking at here are 3 upper air wind flow pattern charts. These are upper air wind flow patterns. So a lot of weather forecasters will look at these kinds of charts to show where the jet stream is. And all you really need to know is the winds aloft follow the lines from west to east. So if we follow a parcel of wind, it would likely come into the U.S., move into the northern plains, and then work its way down in a southeasterly direction into the Midwest, and then would work its way out through the northeastern United States. So these are the upper level winds. And why is that important? Because it tells the forecaster where the storms are going to come from and go to during the future weeks. These charts are all snapshots of analog years that are following what we call the 18-year cycle. Some folks call it the lunar cycle, but regardless, the upper air wind flow pattern tends to get repeated at 18-year intervals. And you can see some similarities in these charts. Certainly 1967 and 2003, you can see that there's a very definite shape comparison here, where we have a ridge of high pressure that is working its way out through the western parts of the United States. And that ridge is what we're looking for this year. These 2 charts, in good agreement, would suggest a warmer and drier tendency for the western part of the United States. But as you travel farther to the east, the temperatures would be a little bit milder, because the air is flowing a little bit from northwest to southeast, bringing cooler air from Canada. So what this suggests, if these 2 years, 1967, 2003, were to repeat again, we would have a tendency for the eastern U.S. Corn Belt and the eastern part of the Canadian prairies to have a little bit of a milder summertime weather pattern. but the ridge over the western part of the Canadian prairies would block precipitation from coming along. And so a portion of the prairies would end up being drier biased. And that's what's the most important part of this chart, is that not only is there a tendency for the prairies to be drier biased this summer, but a portion of the western Corn Belt may also have that same situation, depending on where the ridge axis is located during the course of the summer. Now, the 1985 chart doesn't agree very well. It's a little bit flatter. The ridge is further east and it's flatter. There's not much of a good comparison there. 1985 was a La Nina year. We are not in a La Nina any longer. Our La Nina is gone. So there's not a good comparison for these 2 years necessarily. So we'll be watching these other 2 years, 1967 and 2003. So these charts you're looking at now are percentage of normal precipitation charts, and they are for the summer months. June on the left, July in the middle, and August on the right. And what you need to note is that all of the gold and brown colors are below normal precipitation. And it shouldn't take you too long to be able to identify a trend here, where precipitation in all 3 of these analog years has a tendency to be below normal in June and July. That's very, very important because we just got all this precipitation to fall across the prairies, and there's a lot of farmers up there who are all excited about having the moisture around. But there's going to be a tendency, if these other years are similar enough to ours currently, that there's going to be a drying tendency take place. And so we need to keep that in mind. And the canola crop could still be at risk, and certainly the soybean crop could be at risk up that way, as well as corn and some of the smaller grains. Now, it's somewhat dangerous to make these kinds of comparisons through the analog years, but it was significant enough that I wanted to make sure that I shared that with you. Let's take a look at a couple of other things. Let's go down to the U.S. And for those of you who have followed the U.S. weather rather closely, you probably recognize some of the charts here a little bit in their patterns. This chart in the upper left-hand corner is for April and May for these same 3 analog years. And what I want you to notice is the drier tendency that is here in parts of the western and central Corn Belt, as well as the portions of the southern plains. This is pretty much what happened to us this year, if you recall the percent of normal chart we just saw. Also, the far northern parts of the region had a little bit of a wetter bias, and that tended to be coming from May more than April, but both months had a little bit of a tendency. Well, we've just received some rain in Canada, and we're now getting some rain. I think tomorrow it's going to rain in North Dakota fairly significantly. So there's a lot of similarities in these charts. The southeastern U.S. had been fairly wet this spring. The southeastern states are now drying down a little bit, but this wet bias does match very well. And so does the Texas dryness, especially if you've been following West Texas for their cotton and other crops out that way. But notice here on the June chart, this is very fascinating, I think, because it's a clue as to whether or not we are going to match these other years. Notice the abundant precipitation that's occurring in hard red winter wheat country and parts of the western Corn Belt. You know, if we go back to those percentage normal charts and the soil moisture charts that we had earlier on, you can clearly see that we are turning wetter in those areas. And even the percent of normal chart has that same tendency on it for some of those areas. So there's support here that we're going to maybe move down this road. And I'll show you shortly what the next 2 weeks of rainfall is going to look like, and it's going to match this June chart very closely. The reason why I'm walking through this is that I want you to get comfortable with looking at these 3 analog years, and especially 1967 and 2003, because of the charts that are on the bottom here. Notice what happens to the weather as we go into July and August both. There's a tendency for portions of the western Corn Belt and northern plains to have a drier tendency in those summer months. And that is different data that you're looking at right here versus what we looked at up in Canada for their summer season. And so we have both sets of data agreeing to the same tendency here for below average precipitation to occur in these areas. The bottom line is that we're going to see a period of short-term improvement, and then we're going to see a tendency to get a little dry again. Now, I'm already going to get myself in trouble on time, so I'm going to kind of accelerate things just a little bit here. Another factor for North America weather over these next few weeks will be ocean temperatures. Now, you may scratch your head and wonder how in the world does ocean temperatures have any influence on whether or not it rains or not in North America, but it is amazing how much association there is. And the best way to explain this to you is that if you take a pot of water and you heat it up on your stove, as that water turns warmer, you start noticing steam coming off the surface of the water. That's water vapor. And the warmer the water gets relative to normal, you will see more and more of this water vapor or steam, as the case may be in your kitchen. But as we do the same thing in the oceans, if you warm up the oceans, you release tiny little minute water droplets into the atmosphere. The warmer the water gets, the more water vapor is released into the atmosphere, and then it is caught up by storm systems that are moving across these regions. So you end up dragging more moisture into areas downstream. So the principle here is that we look for areas where the ocean is really warm or really cold. In the case of a cold ocean body, you have much less water vapor. And so because of the less water vapor getting into the air, you get less rain and you get more high pressure systems evolving. So let's take a look at the situation right now. And off the west coast of North America, there's an area of warm water, but more importantly, there's an area of cool water that is off the southern part of the California coast down off the northwest Mexico coast. That cool water is very important. Look at the bottom chart. The bottom chart here, it shows how those water temperatures have changed in the last few weeks. And you'll notice that the cooling is accelerating, becoming more and more significant. And there's still a warming tendency occurring in the areas just to the north of that. But this is important because the colder the water gets off the west coast of the North American coast, and especially the US coast, the higher the potential is for a ridge of high pressure to build into the middle of the North America, including the US plains, and in an extreme case, including Canada too. So we're watching this water body out here because as that water temperature continues to turn cooler, or if it is going to, the potential of having a much stronger ridge of high pressure in the middle of North America in July and August becomes higher. So we're watching that fairly closely. While we have this chart on up here right now, I want to point out a couple other things which really don't have much to do with North America weather right now, but I did want to point out the warm water in the Atlantic and the subtropics there. We just had our first tropical cyclone this past weekend named Anna. It occurred because the water temperatures are so warm over there. But a little farther to the south, notice that there's a little bit of a cooler tendency here in the tropical area of the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see that on the bottom chart, that water is cooling additionally. That may actually inhibit tropical cyclone development as we go forward through the summer. So I wanted to point that out. And then I also wanted to point out that this box here in the eastern equatorial Pacific is where El Nino and La Nina live, and the ocean temperatures there are still more or less neutral. So there's no sign of any La Nina or El Nino coming on. And the last thing while this chart's up here, I want you to look at the water temperature changes out there in the Arabian Sea. This will be really important. We'll talk about India towards the latter part of this presentation, but that cooling that's occurring out there in the Arabian Sea will be a huge factor for India monsoonal rains a little bit later in the summer. The outlook for La Nina and El Nino is pretty neutral. You saw that there wasn't any real cool or warm water out there in the central equatorial region of the Pacific. And this chart just basically reflects that same idea. We are not going to see La Nina or El Nino come into play through the entire growing season this year. And then one last thing that we wanted to look at, because we were in a La Nina earlier this year, we went and did a study to see how the ocean, how La Nina years that turn more neutral, ENSO years later in the growing season, how they influence North America weather. And so this is a result of the study we did. And if you were on our original presentation a couple of months ago, I showed this at that time. It's a little confusing chart, but basically we take 126 years of weather data for various places in the US, and we rank them from wettest to driest or driest to wettest. So the driest year gets the number 1 and the wettest year gets the number 126. And so they just go through, we just rank those years. And so if you're ranked 70, that means that you're, a little bit on the wetter side, but not all that exceptionally wet. But if you're 120, you're a very wet year. So these rankings that you're seeing are those numbers. And I just wanted to point out for the upper Midwest, the Ohio River Valley and the Northern Rockies and Northern Plains, in August in particular, all these numbers are ranked very low. With the exception of 1950 here in the Ohio River Valley. That one didn't work very good, but everybody else has low numbers, which means that there's a bias for August to be drier than normal in all of these areas, the Ohio River Valley, the Northern Plains, the upper Midwest, and portions of neighboring areas in the Rocky Mountains. We can do the same study for Canada and show the same thing. That's why southern Manitoba and southeastern Saskatchewan have a pretty good chance of being drier biased in July and August as well. All right, so with that knowledge, we're going to go back and look at this cool water off the Pacific coast again. But keep in mind, with the fact that La Nina has gone away and we've gone into these neutral conditions, just that factor alone, with no other consideration, we are going to be seeing drier biased weather in parts of the upper Midwest, the Northern Plains, and southeastern Canada's prairies. So now we go back and we look at that ocean temperature bias out there that we were talking about with the cool water off the west coast of North America. The upper left-hand chart here was from back in April and the ocean temperatures there. And the upper right-hand side is what the temperatures are now this last week. And they look somewhat similar, right? A little bit of a cooler tendency. That's telling us that basically we aren't really churning those temperatures all that dramatically cooler. Yes, they turned colder in this last week, as we were showing on the previous chart or two, but we had warmed in April. And so the ocean temperatures are just kind of coming back to where they were before. The bottom chart is where we want to go if we want to see that strong ridge of high pressure to be in the middle of North America. We need the temperatures off that west coast of North America to be quite a bit cooler biased. And we also need that warm tendency out to the west. Well, you can see those shapes are trying to come together in the top two charts. We're moving in that direction, but not very aggressively. And unless we can see more dramatic cooling occur off the west coast of North America, the potential of getting a real dramatically strong ridge of high pressure over North America during the summer becomes a little bit lower. So that's an important factor to keep in mind. This chart is just assessing that. We call this the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And negative values reflect the colder water off North America. And all I really wanted to show here is that we are moving in that cooler than usual tendency. Now, you can see all these other years where we were in the negative phase of PDO. And if you go back in history and look at some of the weather data for North America, you can associate these negative phase PDO summers a lot of times with dryness in parts of North America. Not every time, it depends on what other factors are playing in. And what I want you to notice here, so we're going to be in the negative phase of PDO as that water turns cooler out here. So the tendency for the ridge of high pressure to build a ridge in the middle of North America is fairly high. There's also a tendency that while that is occurring, if the ocean temperatures are warm out in the Atlantic, there's an additional reason to believe that dryness will be a factor in parts of North America, but I won't dwell on that right now because I'm running out of time. So the two upper air wind flow patterns that are likely to prevail as we go forward through the summer are shown here on the left-hand side. And the one that I think is going to verify fairly well is this upper left-hand image. With a ridge of high pressure going right up the middle of North America, this will end up creating a drier tendency in the plains and portions of the Canadian prairies, while we have cooler temperatures and some showers that occur in the eastern Midwest. All right, for the next 2 weeks, the first week of the outlook, we're going to be a little cooler biased in the north central U.S. But as in the second week, we'll start warming up the western part of North America. That's because a ridge of high pressure is going to begin to build up during that time period. Rainfall is expected to be above average in this first week of the outlook in the plains and western Corn Belt, just like we were talking about before, and also pointing to the month of June, having a tendency for that to continue to be the case. The first week of June right here is shown in the green as being a little bit wetter bias. So there's definitely some similarities here to those analog years. So officially the forecast for the US is, as you see here, the month of June, we'll see a mix of weather. We're going to have some above average precipitation early in the month in the plains and western Corn Belt, and then we're going to start drying down a little bit. So the bottom line is kind of near to below average, but there's going to be well-timed precipitation occurring in most of the plains and the Corn Belt, and even the northern plains will be included in a relatively favorable June weather pattern. And the temperatures won't be too abnormal. And the eastern Midwest will be a little bit cooler biased, and rainfalls there is also expected to be maybe near to just slightly below average. But when we get into the summer, that ridge of high pressure is going to be building up over the plains, and we are going to dry down the northern plains. We will also heat up a big part of the region there with temperatures rising above average. Now, if those ocean temperatures off the west coast of North America become dominatingly colder, we're going to see this ridge of high pressure much stronger, and that the below average precipitation you see on the chart will end up being much more broad-based across the corn and soybean belt. What is the bottom line? The bottom line is that we're going to see very good soybean and corn establishment over these next few weeks. The crop will develop favorably. As we go into the second part of the forecast period here, we will likely see a tendency for ridge building to occur. So the corn crop will probably get to reproduction under mostly favorable conditions, but may get a little dry. The soybean crop, however, is going to be faced with a larger percentage of drying perhaps, and we might end up seeing some moisture stress as we get into July and August, especially in the northwestern part of the US Corn Belt, and we may end up seeing some stress for that crop. For Canada, again, the lower left-hand corner is probably the most, or lower right-hand corner is probably most important here, with a below average precipitation bias in the southeastern part of the prairies and a warmer tendency for much of the region. Overall, the bottom line, I pretty much explained it. The southeast prairies, the northern plains, and upper Midwest will have the biggest issue. From a tropical cyclone perspective, we're going to see a less active year this year compared to last year, but the southeastern U.S. will see most of that precipitation. This will be mostly in August and September. And the most important thing is that when we start seeing tropical cyclones impacting this part of the country, it will reinforce the ridge out here in the middle of North America. And so there's another reason why the late summer will end up being drier biased. Real quickly, in the rest of the world, we're finishing up the situation in Brazil right now. Look at the dryness that's present there, both in the top and the subsoil moisture for the safrinha corn production areas. We are getting rain to occur across the southernmost parts of this region over the next week or so, but the rest of this area is going to continue to be very dry. And we've already hurt that crop tremendously by the dry weather that has occurred in the past few weeks. Production is way down and will not likely recover well, even with the rain that's coming up in the southern parts of this region. For Argentina, we've just received some significant rain again. The Argentina crop situation there, it's harvest time for their corn and soybeans and peanuts, and they're coming off fairly well. We did get some significant rain last week to delay the situation a little bit. But most importantly, Argentina's had a poor start to their wheat crop in the last 2 years, and this will be a third year where that's not going to actually happen because they have moisture out there, and they will have a very good planting season, so their wheat crop should get off to a much better start than usual. I'm going to skip through that long-range outlook to try to finish up here real quickly. China produces a lot of corn and soybeans in the northern part of the country across two main areas. One is in this region and the other is up here. And both have good moisture going into the planting season. Crops are getting started pretty darn well. I don't see any major problems in these areas right off the bat. The forecast will turn a little bit drier and warmer bias during the summer in parts of this region. And so we probably will watch that area. I'm not expecting a full-blown droughty pattern, but there will be a tendency for less moisture to be around. So the really good conditions they have right now may deteriorate a little bit as we get into their summer season. For Southeast Asia, the oil palm production areas, the moisture situation is really not too bad. There's some pockets that are a little drier biased, and there's some pockets that are a little bit on the moist side. This is actually a percent of normal chart, so it's probably not, it's a little misleading. If we take a look at soil moisture, you can see that the moisture profile is really pretty good for all the major oil palm production areas there. There is a need for a little bit of rain in northern parts of the Malay Peninsula, maybe northern Sumatra, and there's also a need for some rain in the Philippines, but it's overall not a bad situation. India getting ready for their monsoon season. The month of May has been really good month for a lot of folks out here, a lot of production areas off to the west and south. And we do have some dryness up here in the north, but it doesn't really matter for what May is, because May is typically a hot and dry month. What matters is what's going on across the Indian Ocean. And if you recall, I made those comments about the ocean temperatures turning cooler out there in the Western Arabian Sea. That is basically what is reflected in this chart here. It's the Indian Ocean dipole. And when you go below the green line here, the ocean temperatures out there in the western part of the Indian Ocean tend to be cooler biased. What does that mean? Well, as I explained before, if you cool down the ocean temperatures, you have less water vapor that is brought into areas downstream. And the monsoon season brings the airflow from southwest to northeast into India. So if the water out here in the Arabian Sea is cooler than usual, you pick up less water vapor. And so when the precipitation comes into India, you get a little bit less than normal precipitation. I expect the nation to do fairly well, though, with 94% of their usual precipitation. I think India will do okay this year. Their monsoon will do okay, and most of their oil seeds will probably yield all right. I do expect to see some pockets that will be a little bit stressed. Europe's in pretty good shape. I don't see any major issues coming up for them. The outlook down the road for precipitation, though, is for less than the normal precipitation this summer from France into Germany and parts of Poland. There will be some warm weather also in the western part of that region, so perhaps some stress will come up in the latter part of the summer grain and oilseed production season in Western Europe. But that's about the only other thing that I see a problem. And right now, the driest areas in Russia and neighboring areas of Kazakhstan are out here in the area I've identified. This area is really getting quite dry. They need significant moisture. They're probably going to fight some dryness for a while. Sunseed is produced pretty abundantly in this area, along with spring wheat. So we'll be watching that area pretty closely as well. And in Australia, we're waiting for their spring or autumn precipitation to increase. Most of the winter wheat, barley, and canola is produced down across these areas, and the forecast is for all of that area to turn wetter as we go forward in time. They should do fairly well with precipitation. All the yellow hatching is near to above average precipitation, so I think Australia will do well. The bottom line is it's all about North America. How significant will that ridge of high pressure be in July and August across the middle part of this continent is going to be the main area of interest for the marketplace. And I apologize for taking so long, and I'll turn it back over to Carlos.
Thank you, Drew. Much appreciated. And I think these presentations will be available after our audience completes a survey. Again, we have an increasing number of people participate towards the end of the event. We will actually have this recorded event in social media as well, so people can review it. Drew, I have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm translating here as I talk to you. But I think the question is, given the outlook and the situation that you see today, and I think it's very neat to compare to those analog years from my personal perspective. But what yield upside downside would you see? And let's focus just on one. Let's just say soybeans. You know, what have been the impacts, or what could be the impact upside on downside on soybeans? From what it sounds, it looks like we could probably get hurt more on the downside, but I'd like to get your perspective.
Yeah, I think that, you know, from a planting perspective, everything's been really good. So, and the beans will go in really quite favorably, I believe. The negative side of this is that when we get involved with that ridge, we're going to see enough heat and dryness to deplete soil moisture during the more important pod setting and filling stage in August. And I think that is where the key is. Now, as long as we only regionalize the dryness in North America, you know, the impact overall may not be all that great. But as we saw a little while ago, the ending stocks in the U.S. are extremely tight. And so the big bottom line worry here is that even if only a portion of the U.S. crop is hurt because of dryness, it's still going to have a fairly big impact on the overall bottom line. So my biggest concern right now is about July and August. I think we're going to be fine in June. There won't be any real good reason to be worried about that soybean crop. But when we get into July and August, I do expect to see a problem. I would imagine that it will cut into the overall yield for the nation. A dramatic cut, though, I don't think we're going to see a huge cut in production unless that Pacific Decadal Oscillation does go substantially colder, and then we're going to have a massive ridge and then all bets are off. But I don't think that's where we're going this year. Conditions just don't support that kind of a serious dryness problem.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew, this is the situation in South America. I think the maps for the small corn crop, which is safrinha, which is actually the large corn crop, and I think the map is pretty clear. Any implications on soybeans that will come out to be planted next? What is your view on that, and how should we read that?
Yeah, you know, right now we're supposed to have this neutral ENSO condition, no El Nino, no La Nina through the majority of 2021. If that stays the case, then seasonal rains in late September and October should come back relatively normally. One of the things that I'm looking at, though, is that La Nina will return. And at the moment, there's no forecast models out there that are reliable that are saying anything about La Nina returning in this calendar year. As long as it doesn't show up in that fourth quarter, we're going to be fine, and we'll have a good start to the production season in Brazil. The rains will come on and they'll do all right. But if La Nina is returning during that time period, we're going to see once again an inhibited start to the rainy season, and that could be a significant factor. Now, one of the things that I see right now is that there's really no sign of any notable cooling, and I don't think in the ocean, the equatorial region of the Pacific. In order for La Nina to be back in a significant enough manner to alter the start of the rainy season, we're going to have to see some cooling in that eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean, probably by the time we get to August. August and early September. If we're not already seeing some cooling tendencies there, then most likely the rainy season will begin okay. If La Nina kicks in a little bit later in the year, then what will happen is we'll get the initial rains will come on okay, and most likely we'll see some sputtering of the rainfall when we get into November, December. It's not going to quit raining, but it might be lighter than normal. So for now, I'm going to say we're probably going to see a relatively normal start. But boy, watch closely. If we see any sign of La Nina coming, then you're going to know that we're going to have some more issues next year.
Very well noted. Thank you. Well, on behalf of USEC, I'd like to thank you, Drew. I'd like to thank James as well for joining us today.